I appreciate you co-sponsoring this with us today, and he goes way, way back.
Well, thank you, George. Great to be here for this wonderful occasion. The first time I met Gary Habermas, Dr. Gary Habermas, I was actually at church, and he came up to me, as I recall, introduced himself, and told me that he was the new professor at William Tyndale College. I happened to be a student there and was signed up for his class starting that fall. He also asked me, he said, "Do you live around here?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "How about we carpool together?" And so that started a friendship that has lasted to this day. And I am so grateful for knowing this man. Not just his scholarship, which is appreciated now around the world. Truly, what you are about to hear today from this man is after decades of research, and he is regarded as the preeminent authority on the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And it isn't just people who say that, somebody on YouTube or something. But these are people who know what they're talking about that call him that, that refer to him that way. And so people that are in the field. So what you're getting today is incredibly valuable that you're here today. Take good notes. And if you buy one of his books or something, or if you have your Bible, have him sign it for you. And if you don't get a chance to do that, and you're at Stony Creek Church tomorrow, you can see him there. He's going to be speaking at both of our services, 10 o'clock and 11:30, and sharing his testimony from doubter to believer. And if you're attending here at Hope to see Dr. Beck, and you would like to also see Gary and giving his testimony, it will be on our live stream, and you can access that. Just go to stonycreek.church. And Stony has no E. stonycreek.church. All one word with the dot in there. All right? And so, as you probably know, Dr. Habermas is distinguished, not extinguished, distinguished professor of philosophy and apologetics at Liberty University. So please give a big welcome to my dear friend and great scholar, Dr. Gary Habermas.
I'm down here, so come on, I'm down here. Thanks, man. How are you?
This guy has saved my life. Truly, he has.
Norm Geisler, a lot of you know from this area, one of my dear friends when he was alive, used to say about introductions like that. He used to say, great introductions are like perfume. You're supposed to sniff them, you're not supposed to drink them. So I have to be careful not to drink them, because if my wife was here, she'd say, don't get a big head. So thank you, Randy. Hey, wait till you see what I wrote in your book here. I'll show them the book in a second. I referred to the carpool, and I even referred to the frozen custard driving home every day, or almost every day. We had about 5 guys in a carpool going to Tyndale. My daughter still lives in the house. My sister still lives in the house that I lived in those days, at 12 and a half and Hoover Road. So from this area, grew up here, and I've been at Liberty since '81, so it's been a long time. Thank you, Randy, very, very much. He's been a great friend. You know what? He doesn't know what I wrote in this book. This book is, I brought it for him. I'll show it to you in a second. You don't even know what I wrote in it, but I've been teaching school, college and grad school only, for, let me add up real fast, 48 years. And I wrote in there that, dead serious, because it's in print. I'm not just saying this to make up for his perfume. I said, Randy is one of the top 5 students I've ever had in 48 years of teaching. So, and we still talk. The reason I brought him this book is because he reviewed 2 chapters of it. I've got a minor in Greek, okay, 16 hours. You know what 16 hours of Greek makes you? Dangerous. I don't know Greek. He's got a PhD in Greek. So I sent he and 2 other New Testament scholars, 3 guys with PhDs in New Testament, 2 chapters each, and he proofread 2 of my chapters to make sure I didn't spell the Greek words wrong. So, and then the guy that reviewed this book has a PhD in Semitics, so he re-corrected my Greek, and he took all my sources outside the scripture, Randy, and put them in a Latin index in the front of the book. I've been associated with some really, really good people, and I'll show you the book in just a moment. So thank you so much. How's that? How's that talking about an introduction, How's that? Folks, I'm talking today about the resurrection of Jesus. And George, I didn't even ask you. I go to how long here? About 5?
Yeah. 2 o'clock on the resurrection, and then a short break.
A break and then creeds. Okay, so 2 o'clock here. Okay. Well, just to show you guys how much we're doing and how much I only have time for today, I teach a PhD course on the resurrection for PhD students. I'm just saying and you know what? It is the course. I only teach PhD students. It is the course where I never finish my notes. I can't get through the material. So if there's too much material here for a PhD course, I'm only saying if you want to get into this, there's a lot of other things to read and study. This is a field that anybody who does evidences or theology, they've got to do the resurrection. And they have to, because in the scripture I'm going to turn to real fast here, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when Paul, and by the way, this is relevant for the second lecture, because it's a creed, and that's the second lecture. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, first 2 verses, he says, when I came to you Corinthians, I gave you the gospel, and I'm summarizing the first 2 verses, paraphrasing the first 2 verses. He says, if you believed it, you're saved, and if not, you're not. It's that simple. There's a gospel message, he says, and if you believed it when I came, because 2 things make the gospel. You got the data and the commitment, the I do part, I'm committing my life to Christ. And he said, when I came, I presented the gospel message. If you trusted Christ in light of this message, you're saved. And if not, you're not. And then he starts in verse 3, and he says, this is a creed, so just keep that in mind for the second lecture. He says, I gave you what I was given. Now, that's not very heavy, right? But just unpack what Paul's saying. He's saying, this is not my material. I'm giving you something. Paul talking, not me. Paul says, I'm giving you something that was given to me earlier. I call this a first century footnote because they don't footnote like we do with a 1 and, and a source. Paul says, I gave you what I was given. He's saying, I got this from somebody else. And that's when we put a footnote there. Paul's telling you it's a footnote. And in verse 3, he defines the gospel. And whenever the gospel data are defined in the New Testament, now, time out. Gospel is used for a lot of things. Gospel can be used for creation. It can be used for a lot of words. But I'm talking about the kind of gospel that Paul's discussing in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 and 2. This is the kind of thing that when you become wed to it, when you say, I do to Jesus, you've entered the kingdom. So I'm talking about the use of gospel. Evangelion is the Greek, and it means good news. This is the good news of eternal life. And so there's some content, and then there's an I do part. Because we can believe the content, we can believe it happened and not say I do, right? You can date somebody for a long time and think they're the right person to get married to, and you don't say I do, and you're not married, right? A lot of people believe the facts of the gospel and they don't say I do to Jesus. And that's what the Greek word means, by the way. Pistis, pistuo, the Greek words mean to jump in with both feet. They mean to commit your life. For example, both Peter and John say, if you believe Christ, you will walk in his steps. And you go, oh no, this sounds like salvation by works. No, it doesn't. Time out. When you get married, when you say I do, nobody says, I got married by good works. You got married by making a commitment. I do is a commitment. My Greek professor at William Tyndale College in the old days, my Greek professor said you could translate John 3:16 like this. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever commits himself to him, because that's what the Greek means, whoever commits himself to him shall not perish but have everlasting life. That much of an intro. Paul says, here's the gospel, y'all. What did you do with it? Did you say yes to Jesus? If you did, you're in. If you didn't, you're not in yet. I'd like you to come there. And then he defines it in verse 3. And the commitment part is the getting on board, same thing we do in marriage. Now, years ago, my wife that Randy knew, the mother of my 4 children, died of stomach cancer in 1995. I'm remarried. But when I got remarried to my present wife, a friend of the family for 15 years, Jerry Falwell Sr. married us, and our backs are to the crowd. And he said, Gary, this is Jerry Falwell Sr., Gary, in a minute or two, I'm going to ask you if you're going to say I do and take this woman as your lawful wedded wife. He said, but I want you to know something. When you say I do, everything you own belongs to her. And she had this white dress on, right? And she goes like this with her back to the crowd. She goes, yes. And everybody blew up. It was just hilarious. But that's a picture of the gospel, really, because when you say I do to a person, the question is, to whom are you saying I do? And these 3 things, whenever these facts are defined, it's always these. They're deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. You go, what about buried? Well, buried is there in this passage, but buried's not always there. Buried is there about half the time, and half the time it isn't when the gospel's defined. But deity, he's got to be the Son of God. He's got to be Lord, which a lot of New Testament scholars say today, Lord is the loftiest title given to Jesus, because in the New Testament, Romans 10:9, we'll talk more about this in creeds. Romans 10:9, the word for Lord there, Paul defines as the God of the Old Testament. Yahweh, Jehovah. So if that's your view of Jesus, that he's that high, and he died for your sins and rose from the dead, and you make a commitment, that Paul says, get you right in this passage, you're saved. Now, how much is there on evidence to do today? That's more than I run out of time in a PhD class. I've written 50 books, 20-something around the resurrection. This one just came out. This is the evidence alone. It's almost 1,000 pages. It doesn't fit on my bookshelf because it's too big for it's a half-inch over professional size for a book. They had to do that to make it worth, you got to pay for this. Somebody's got to pay for this printing. I'm only holding it up. I'm not trying to say, look at me. I'm saying, look at the data out there. And this is one of 4 volumes on the resurrection. They're each about 1,000 pages long. That's 4,000 pages on this topic. Please, I'm not saying look at me. I'm saying keep this in mind when you ask, how much data do we have to make this story work? Now, go right into it. I'm down here on the floor. And I have a PowerPoint, but I never use it anymore for this one because I'm going to be walking the whole time. How many of you have seen this lecture before where I walk a PowerPoint timeline? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know what the record is? I've got a guy in England who's seen this lecture. He goes out of his way to get it when he drives around. He's seen it 60 times. It's not complicated. It's not philosophy, that kind of complicated. It's complicated like history. There's a lot of moving parts to it. They're not complicated moving parts, but there's a lot of them. This is the watch that Dave Beck talked about. We're going to take the watch apart, okay? There's a lot of things to talk about. So I'm going to step down here. This is a timeline. That's creation way down there. That's 2024, way down there. In between, I'm only stepping off here about 65 years in the middle of the human timeline. This is the death of Jesus, almost always said by scholars to be 30 AD. The second most popular year, by the way, is not 31 or 29, it's 33. You got to get the calendar right because of Passover. But let's call this 30, just for the sake of the argument. It's 30 AD. And everything Jesus did, what we call the gospel, he's been teaching, and he's Lord, he's Son of God, he's Christ, Messiah. He's crucified for blasphemy. And Saturday was what you might call, some people call it Black Saturday. It was a bad day because these disciples and women had followed Jesus with all their lives for 3 years, and it looked like it was worth nothing. It's worse than you losing the NCAA playoff and having to go home. It's happening right now, right? It's worse than having the tournament over. This is your life is over on Saturday. Saturday, worst day in their life. Sunday, the best day in their life. That's what happened this weekend, 30 AD. Now, if you ask the average Christian, how do you show this is true? There's different ways to make this argument. The most popular way to make the argument is to go like this. Well, have you heard of the Gospel of Mark? Mark writes his gospel in 60 to 70 AD. A recent survey was done. Most scholars put it between 60 and 70. You subtract 30 years, and this is only 30 to 35 years after the cross. Now, let me make a point. We're doing history here. Two of the most important rules in doing history are finding early eyewitnesses. You want an early eyewitness. Not all eyewitnesses are early, and not everybody who's early is an eyewitness. In fact, I'll give you one example. Heard of a guy who wrote his memoirs of World War II. Now, my dad passed away 2 years ago, but he was Special Forces in Germany. We're German. And he told our family, as are many people at this church, my dad said to my mom, we weren't bored, us kids, he said, I'm going to Germany to fight the Nazis. The Nazis are not the Germans. They're different people, like communists and Russians in those days. And he said, and he went to Germany to fight. And just like that kind of division, when you come here to do this kind of thing, you're talking about Mark being 30 years. I know of a guy who wrote his memoirs of World War II, but here's the problem. He was an eyewitness, but he wrote them in 1990. Okay, that's eyewitness, but not early, right? He wrote it 45 years later, pretty much getting a little long for history, but he was an eyewitness. What we want is early and eyewitness material. Mark is about plus, it's going to be the 30 to 40 years. Again, you got to subtract 30 from the cross. Now, I'm going to use critics' dating just to show you that even if the critics are right, it doesn't really make a difference. Evangelicals usually put Matthew and Luke in the 60s, and they back Mark up a little bit. But critics put Matthew and Luke about 80, no big deal. It's 20 years, but it doesn't change anything I'm saying. So Matthew is usually dated at 80 or 50 years after the cross. Luke at 85 or 55 years after the cross. And everybody dates John about 95 AD, approximately 90 to 100, 90 AD. The worst it gets for the Gospels, then, in terms of years, is plus 65. Right, you all with me? 95 minus 30 plus 65. And critics do this number. That is so long. Mark wrote at plus 30 to 40. That is so long. All right, dude, let's talk about your sources, okay? Let's talk one secular example, one religious example. Buddha. I have a Buddhist book on my shelf by a PhD Buddhist British professor, and he starts his book on page 1 like this. He says, we Buddhists, we don't have what Christians have. He gets into his book like this. We don't have what Christians have. They have the words of their Lord. We don't, Buddha, Lord Buddha. They have the words of the Lord. We don't. They have the words of those who studied under their Lord and those who study under them. It's called the New Testament. We have nothing like that. He says, in fact, the sources I'm going to reproduce for you, this book, are basically 600 to 800 years after Buddha lived. Oh, so Mark's horrible at plus 30, the critics say, and Buddha's just fine at 600 to 800? And I'll tell you the way critics write about this. They don't know the years for Buddha's sources as a rule, New Testament guys. And they'll go like this. Well, Buddha said, and Buddha said, and Buddha said. For instance, they'll say, Buddha taught the silver rule before Jesus taught the golden rule. Well, first of all, if that's true, I'm not surprised. I wouldn't deny it for a moment, because Romans, the verses Dave Beck talked about, Romans says we're born with a moral code. I would expect good religious teachers, Confucius, Buddha, I would expect them to have some good moral teachings. I have no problem. But here's the big problem. Buddha did this, Buddha did that, Buddha said. And this guy in this Buddhist scriptures book, the Buddhist PhD, he goes on to say, we don't have the words of our Lord. In fact, we don't even know what he taught. Come again? We don't know what he taught. He said, people want to know what Buddhist school of thought do I belong to. I won't answer the question. It starts wars. And why should I answer the question? We don't know. Okay? So, is John okay at plus 65 since your best source is plus 600? I guess so. And what if we get back to the eyewitnesses, which we're going to do here and in the next lecture? Yes, we're going to get back to the... So you're going to have early eyewitnesses and you're going to really close this distance? Yes. So you're going to have better sources than Buddha? Yes. Okay. Some other examples. The Upanishads of the Hindus. Plus 1,800 years. John's horrible at 65. See, the critics like to jump on us and go, yeah, but Buddha says, and the Upanishads say, do your historical homework. They're way, 10 times, 20 times later than our sources. This one kills me. Hinduism, the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna. Remember George Harrison, My Sweet Lord? Krishna, the earliest copy of the Bhagavad Gita. Got to be ready. Plus 4,200 years. But 60, you guys are crazy. You're using late sources. Folks, no religion is earlier. No religion has earlier sources. Now, I was doing this one time. I used to walk all the way around. I'd say, here's the earliest source for Buddha. And I'd walk around and come down the middle and all the way around. One time I was in a church. I've done this a lot of times. And I was in a church. They had a side door in the sanctuary. I went out it to show them how long the book was. I mean, how old Buddha was. And the door locked. I had to pound on the door to get back into the sanctuary. But, okay, so Buddha doesn't compare. How about the secular sources? I'm not going to use a good one. I'm sorry, I'm not going to use a bad one. Let me use a good one. Alexander the Great. Look at the History Channel. We know a lot about Alexander. Yeah, right. We sort of know a lot about Alexander. Earliest biography we have is almost 300 years after Alexander died. The best two biographies, the ones historians rely on the most for Alexander, ready? 4.25 and 450 after. But John's horrible at 60. I'd rather use Alexander at plus 4.25 and 450 or Buddha at plus 600. It's just not fair. They're not playing a fair game here. And if you want to use this argument and do the Gospels from Mark to John, we've got it. My research assistant, who's worked with me on all 4 of our volumes, I'm doing volume 4 right now. Volume 2 is due out in September. It's Refutations of Natural Theories, and it's 900 pages long. Volume 3 is about 850, and I'm doing volume 4. My research assistant has a PhD, and he's done his master's and PhD dissertations on the resurrection. He's one of those knowledgeable guys in the world on the resurrection, my assistant. He also, by the way, for you MMA fans, he's got a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So he really keeps a close watch on me. He watches my back. He goes to a lot of speaking engagements with me. We have a good time together. But he just wrote a book, watch for it, this summer with InterVarsity. It's either called Reliable or Trustworthy. I know those are kind of synonyms. It's either called Reliable or Trustworthy, and it's 13 different arguments for the reliability of the New Testament. And these are very good arguments. You probably haven't heard 5 of them. They're really creative, but the critical scholars are deeply into these things. Creeds, our second lecture, is one of them. And there's just a lot for the New Testament. The time is fantastic on the world scale, and the data are great. But I'm going to use a different argument today. I'm giving you 2 arguments for the resurrection. The first one is use Mark to John. Here's the other one that critics like more. I'm going to start with Paul. Paul is the critics' darling. They love Paul. Because if you put yourself in the critic's shoes, the New Testament scholars who are, let me use the strongest ones, New Testament scholars who are atheists and agnostic or some other religion. Atheistic, and you go, there are people, atheists and agnostic New Testament scholars? Yeah, ask Dr. Randy's shaking his head, yes. Some of the best known ones are atheists or agnostics. And they're all over the New Testament for a lot of reasons. I mean, it's their professional field. And they're going to allow the data that I'm going to use here. They're going to allow it. Atheist and agnostic and non-Christian, like Jewish. There are Jewish, not converted Jews, non-converted Jewish New Testament scholars. And they're going to grant these things. Okay? Here's why they like Paul. They don't think any apostles wrote the 4 Gospels. Now, they will. Mike Lacona just did 2 surveys. His master's students did 2 surveys. The majority of scholars do think Mark wrote Mark and Luke wrote Luke. The majority of scholars. These 2 studies are just out. But Matthew and John are the 2 for apostles, and they don't think they wrote either one of them. You have to think like a critic does. They won't give you Matthew or... They'll let you use Matthew and John if they're good arguments, but they don't think they're written by apostles. They like Paul because Paul was an apostle, not one of the 12, but he's an apostle, just like James, the brother of Jesus, not one of the 12, but an apostle. And we'll talk about James a little bit. But they love Paul for the following reasons. Number one, he was a scholar's scholar. He basically had a PhD in Old Testament, studied under Gamaliel, studied under the best source. When one of the guys in our field say, I just got a PhD and I studied under Richard Bauckham, or Larry Hurtado when he was alive, Jimmy Dunn at Durham when he was alive. But when you say, you get a lot of credit points for studying under, not just at a good school, but under a very influential person. And they think Paul was that kind of guy. Basically a PhD in Old Testament, studies under, now Acts tells us that he studied under Gamaliel. But Paul does say he's a Pharisee. He was a Pharisee, so Paul is a scholar. So they love him because he's a scholar. They will grant that he believes he saw the risen Jesus. He had an experience, a real experience, that he believed was a resurrection appearance. So they say Paul, critics will often say Paul's the only source for the resurrection of which we have eyewitness data. Not true, but they will frequently say that. Another thing, they don't think Paul's inerrant or something like that. These guys are atheists and agnostics. They'll say Paul is reliable. and he would not willingly lie. He's a very moral man. He won't lie to you, so he's trustworthy. Paul will tell you what he thinks is true. He was there. He's a scholar. We love Paul. One more thing about Paul. Of the 13 books that bear Paul's name in the New Testament, critics will let you use 7 of them. Now, this is kind of a test on how conservative you are, maybe. Do you say, no, if I can't get 13, we're not talking? Then you're really conservative. If you say, you're going to give me 7? Which 7 are you going to give me? The main ones. You ready for their 7? This is virtually unanimous. Bart Ehrman, the atheist New Testament scholar, calls these unanimous, unanimously conceded. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Now, Philemon's for the most part, non-theological book. So you've got 6 others to work with if you do only the critics' data. Again, those 6 would be Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, the first 4 that bear Paul's name, and then you also get Philippians and 1 Thessalonians, which is probably the earliest New Testament book, 1 Thessalonians. Paul, if he were martyred in the early 60s, like critics think, then basically all his epistles were written from 50 to 60, 62 AD. See, what they're saying is, and by the way, the earliest one is 1 Thessalonians, according to almost everybody. Some people put 1 Thessalonians at 48 AD. It's a minority view. Most say 50. But what I'm saying is Paul's 50 to 60 make him earlier than Mark. It's another reason they like to use Paul. Now here's my philosophy, my strategy, using philosophy that way. If they're going to give me those 6 or 7, they give you 7, but I'm not going to use Philemon for part of my argument. So if I'm going to use those 6, if they're going to give me those 6, I'll take the 6 and run. If they give me a football, I'll play football with them, right? If they give me a volleyball and say, let's play football, it's going to be a little bit different. But if they say, we're going to give you these 6, I'll take that ball. I coached ice hockey. I was the head coach at Liberty for 9 years. I'll take that puck. That's my example. I'll take that puck. You're going to give me, and that's what I'm going to do right here. I'm going to use their man, Paul. I'm going to use their sources, those 6. And I'm going to start right here with 1 Thessalonians, which beats Mark. According to most people, it's going to beat Mark by 15 maybe all the way up to 30 years. Paul's earlier. And they'll grant that Paul's an eyewitness to the resurrection. What he believed was, they don't think that Jesus was really raised from the dead, but they think Paul thought that. And Paul's honest. So they'll grant you that Paul had that experience reported in 1 Corinthians 9:1, 1 Corinthians 15:8. All right, so start with Paul. Now, let me say something about, I told you, deity, death, resurrection. Virtually nobody questions Jesus' death. Virtually nobody. You could almost name the reputable scholar. You could maybe, of the ones that really write, less than a half dozen say Jesus didn't die. By the way, my co-author, Ben, and a medical doctor friend of mine, MD, PhD in neurology, the 3 of us wrote an article together, published it in a medical journal, on we didn't argue how Jesus died, we argued how the majority of medical scholars think Jesus died on the cross. I'll just say only this much about the death of Jesus. By far the most common view, in fact, it has twice as many as all the other views put together on how Jesus died, is that Jesus died by asphyxiation. Now, a lot of people are stridently against it, but there's a lot of medical scholars that are for it. And they don't question it. The data are good. And even if we don't know what Jesus died from, we have evidences. Ask me during the Q&A if you want. We have evidences that Jesus died. Doesn't make any difference how he died, what he died from, but that he died is virtually undeniable. So you got death. So let me spend time on deity and resurrection. Deity. 1 Thessalonians does not start like this. Hey, you guys remember me coming there and talking to you about Jesus? Well, let me tell you something. We believers call him Messiah, Son of God, and Lord. Let me give you definitions. Paul doesn't start that way. When Paul starts 1 Thessalonians, he calls him Son of God. He calls him Lord. The loftiest titles for Jesus. Now, Jesus is also called God about 6 to 9 times in the New Testament, depending on what the Greek syntax is. You say, well, why don't you just count them? Why do you say 6 to 9? Romans 9:5, for example, it's very hard to tell if Paul's talking about God the Father or Jesus the Son. So 6 to 9 times. But most New Testament scholars think Lord is loftier than the term God. Do you go with that, Randy? Okay, there's your Christology guy. Lord is the key, and you'll see why when we talk about creeds. Lord is a heavy, heavy term. In its heaviest use, Lord in the New Testament is the equivalent of Jehovah in the Old Testament. I just finished reading a book yesterday by Michael Heiser. Do you read Heiser? Unfortunately, just died of cancer. He was like 61 years old, great Old Testament scholar. And he says in Daniel 7, which Jesus quoted twice, applying to himself, Michael Heiser calls Jesus' use of the Ancient of Days, God the Father, sends the Son of Man in Daniel 7. Jesus is the most popular name for himself, Son of Man. And Heiser calls him Jehovah in flesh. That's what he calls Jesus. Jehovah in the flesh. And he says it over and over. Those are heavy words. Well, back to Paul of 1 Corinthians. Paul doesn't define these terms. He's already been to Thessalonica. He's already told these people what these words mean. And so he starts his book. I remind you, he's Son of God. He's Lord. Whoa. When did Paul start teaching this to them? Well, we'll talk about that. But this book is 50 AD, which is only 20 years. Paul went and taught it earlier. How early? All right, we'll see right now. Let's go back here. I forgot where the cross was. I think it was about here. Okay, right here? There you go. Thank you for marking that. All right, here's the cross. This is often a standalone lecture for me. What I'm going to do next, but I'm going to roll it into this one. 6 things, 6 key events in favor of Christianity, all by 36 AD. Whoa! John's okay at plus 65? Matthew and Luke are okay from 80? Evangelicals say 60, but even critics, 80s, that's 50. Mark's okay from, Paul's great at just 20? Yeah, how do you like 6? By the way, we're going to get a lot closer than 6. You go, how do you do that? That's what we're doing right now. All right. Thank you. Jesus dies. Jesus dies right here. Right here, I can't even move over closely enough. Black Saturday. Bad day. Our world it's over. John says on Sunday, before they knew Jesus was raised, says of the men who let the women go to the tomb by themselves. Now, it is true that it was the women's job to bury in first century Palestine. The women buried bodies, but the men let them go alone. Why is that bad? Because John said the men were hiding for fear of the Jews. So if you're that scared for yourself, why'd you let the ladies go by themselves? Well, that's easy. They won't hurt the women. Baloney. Read what happened in Jerusalem during the Jewish-Roman War, 66 to 70 AD. They crucified thousands of people outside of Jerusalem. You ready now? Men, women, and children. They crucified them. Why? They wanted to make a mark on these guys. Get out of your city. We want it. We want you out of here. We're going to plunder this place. We're going to kill all of you. And we're going to start killing kids if you don't stop. We're going to start killing women. Don't tell me the women were totally safe. But John tells us the men were hiding for fear of the Jews. Bad Saturday until Sunday morning. Bad time. So, but then after Saturday is Sunday. Do you remember Karin, the singer? He passed away a few years ago. Carmen, the Christian singer, used to say, Friday was a bad day, Saturday was a bad day, but Sunday's on the way. Great comment. Sunday's on the way. I wish I had time to talk about the women. Critics, there's over 20 good arguments for the empty tomb during that book. Over 20 good arguments not the way evangelicals do it, or I'd have 40, but the way critics do it, where they give you way less sources. There's more than 20 arguments for the empty tomb. Two of the best is that the women, all four Gospels, writing in different parts, they weren't next door neighbors, the four Gospel writers. They were around the Mediterranean. Traditionally, Mark's written from Rome, John's written from Ephesus. They were strewn around them, and they all say the women were the first witnesses. Why? The women were not good witnesses, not just for Jews. The women weren't good witnesses for any religion, any people group around the Mediterranean. Women were not good witnesses. Why do you say the women are your first witnesses? Because it's true. What's that say about the Gospels? They're interested in truth. Now, they could have said the men were they couldn't say they were the first one to go, but they could say the men went. Luke and John talk about the men going to the tomb after the women did. You could have started there. No, they started with the women because it's true. Okay, here's the 6 things between here and there. Sunday, Jesus appears to the disciples and a few others. Jesus appears. Do you know that of the appearances of the risen Jesus, Jesus appeared more times to groups, and I mean 2 or more, Emmaus, 2 or more is a group. Jesus appeared to groups more times than he appeared to individuals. That's cool because groups are more evidential. First of my 6 points, he appeared to groups. Which the really strong critics, atheists, agnostics, non-Christian, New Testament scholars, what do they think the best group of appearances, which they think is the best evidence? They're telling us this. They don't believe it happened, but what do they think is the best, where we have the best sources? The 12. The appearance for the 12 is the strongest source because there's what critics call multiple attestation. You have a bunch of good sources for the appearance of the 12. That happens on Sunday. So number 1 of the 6 is Jesus appears to the disciples on Sunday. Second of my 6, I know I can run these 2 together, so sometimes I say 5 events before this. Where does James come in? In Mark 3, Mark 6, John 7, James is an unbeliever and the other brothers. John just says flat out, John 7:5, for as yet the brothers did not believe in Jesus. Now this one's a little bit of, I'll have to take this with a grain of salt. As far as we know, James was not at the cross. I don't think he and Jesus were very tight. And he's not at the cross. John is there. The women are there. Once again, the women are there. Disciples weren't, except for John. James is not. But when Jesus ascends, Acts 1:11, Jesus ascends. A few verses later, there in what we call the upper room, our name for it, it says about 120 believers are there. And at the end of the list of who's there, it says Mary and the boys are there. Mary and the brothers of Jesus are there. We don't know when James became a Christian, but I doubt he was a Christian at the cross, and he was in the upper room shortly after the ascension. That's 40 days for the ascension. And Peter hasn't preached his, Pentecost sermon. It's about 40 to 50 days. And James seems to come then. So the 12 was before James, and James becomes a believer. What an event. How would you like to have been there when Jesus appeared to his brother? Here's my interpretation of that appearance. It goes like this. Bro, it's me. You know what these are? These are wounds. They're healed. And what did James do? Did he fall on his knees and worship Jesus? He was not a believer. Do you know something? we have an early report of the appearance to James, not in the New Testament, but it's in a little book that's not a real good source, but just so you know, it's a book called The Gospel of the Hebrews, about 125 to 150 AD, 25 to 50 years after John, and it shows Jesus coming in and appearing to James, and they have a meal together. It's really touching. It's only a little fragment, but we have the appearance written down. How'd you like to have been there? Dude, let's get over this unbelief stuff, okay? Sort of like The Chosen, you know? Sort of like one of those things. So James is number 2. That's a second event before, it's about 40 to 50 days, so it's less than 5 to 6 years. Okay, third event. I'll get there when I talk about creeds, but there's something earlier than the creeds that the creeds are based on. They are called, in Greek, they're called the homologia. I'll spell it for you. H-O-M-O, and then logia, which you probably remember from John 1:1, L-O-G-I-A. Logia means words. Homo means one. The word together means one word. And it was the early proclamation of the gospel. Gerrit Ludemann, unfortunately, died a couple years ago, but he was a German atheist New Testament scholar. German atheist New Testament scholar. He said the disciples began, here they are, the 12 is the best appearance, got James. They began preaching the gospel, Gerrit Ludemann's word, immediately. Remember early in Eyewitness? Who are the guys talking? The eyewitnesses. How soon? Immediately. German atheist. Very prominent New Testament scholar. And that's a third thing. Homologia. We have the earliest preaching. Where do we get it? More about this later, but if you ask evangelicals, where do you get that text? Evangelicals go, read the book of Acts. You ask critical scholars who don't believe the Bible is inspired, where do you get that homologia? Book of Acts. Whoa! You guys agree? No. What? Evangelicals take the book of Acts, hook, line, and sinker. The critics take the creeds in the book of Acts, and they get the same message. Here's how it works. I don't want to get into the next lecture, but in Acts 1 through 5, 10, and 13, 1 through 5 and 10 are Petrine, 13 is Pauline, and every one of them, the center of the proclamation, every time, deity, death, resurrection. Deity, death, resurrection. Deity, death, resurrection. Acts 1 through 5, 10, and 13, the message is the same. So, fact 1, he appeared to the 12 and the others. More than one appearance. I don't mean to imply there's only one. 2, James. 3, the homologia, the immediate preaching. 4th, the creeds. I'm going to let this go because I have a whole nother lecture on it. The creeds are number 4. And then, at plus, I'm getting my gap too big here. At 2 to 3 years after the cross, Paul comes to Christ. You say, why do you say 2 to 3? Because it doesn't make a difference if you're conservative or liberal. Virtually everybody says 2 to 3. They're not agreed on which year it has to be, but it's 2 or 3. And Paul's here. Now, let's turn toward Damascus. Paul's going to Damascus at 2 to 3 years after. And some of these atheist New Testament scholars go, these creeds were already around. And Paul was ticked. Why? He's a Pharisee. He doesn't believe the deity of Jesus. And these guys have creeds already. The Jesus Seminar, who reject 91% of the red-letter words of Jesus. They're not conservative. They reject 91% of the red-letter words of Jesus. They say that creed that we talked about, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following, which is the early list of appearances, they say it was in existence before Paul left for Damascus. How like that? Here's the homologia, the basis for the creeds. was unstructured, just preaching. Here's the creeds, which we'll talk about. And Paul's leaving, and can you believe it? They're calling Jesus God. They're using the name Jehovah for him. Kill these people. Paul himself says, I was breathing out threatenings against the church. And Paul's on his way to Damascus, and he meets the risen Lord. He already knew the creeds. He already knew a lot of the creeds. This stuff was a tight argument. He already knew the creeds. And he meets the risen Jesus. Couldn't have happened to a better guy, right? The appearance of the 12 and the others, James, the homologia, the basis for the creeds, and now Paul, number 5. Paul is setting his sights for Damascus, wanting to kill he never says he killed anybody, but he said he testified against them to their deaths. So he gave testimony, at least, for them to be killed. He knew the creeds. He meets the risen Jesus. And what's the 6th one? He says, 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem. You can do the math. The only question we have is, did Paul come to Christ at +2 or +3? That's the only difference. So here's Jesus. He appears. All right. So he appears to the 12, then to James. They began preaching immediately. The creeds develop. Paul's on his way to Damascus. He meets the Lord. 3 years later, he goes up to Jerusalem. This is the book of Galatians, and critics will grant this argument. You'll hardly find a critic who will not grant this argument. Galatians 1. What were you going to do what did you do in Galatia? I mean, it was to the Galatian church. What did you do in Jerusalem? He went to Jerusalem. He said, I spent 15 days with Peter. I saw no other apostle but James, the brother of Jesus. They were like co-pastors in the church of Jerusalem. He spends 15 days with Peter and James. Bart Ehrman, the well-known New Testament atheist critic, he goes, those guys got to spend 15 days with Peter and James. And Ehrman says, I'd like to spend 15 days with Peter and James. That's pretty cool. Paul spends 15 days with them. What was he talking about? By the way, there's a little Greek word, well, it's not so little, a word in Greek in Galatians 1:18, hysteresis. Hysteresis, the root word is the Greek word from which we get the word history. Now you have to transliterate. Greek is not English letters, but when you transliterate, hysteresis, the root is Histor. How's it translated? It doesn't mean, you can't say he was playing the historian. That's too strong. But it does mean he was inquiring. He was doing research. He was checking it out. And I'm thinking, what do you expect him to do? He's a Pharisee. He's got a PhD in Old Testament. He's doing research. Wait a minute. You talked to Peter and James? Yep. Cool. What is your first question? I'll tell you my first question of Peter and James. Hey, you guys may have heard that I met Jesus on the road to Damascus. I've heard you met Jesus, but I haven't heard it from you and you haven't heard it from me. I'll tell you what. I'll tell you my testimony if you tell me your testimony. And it's got to be on the resurrection because that was the center of everything. But in Galatians 2, when Paul goes back to Galatians, he specifically says in Galatians 2:2, critics ran it, I set before the apostles the gospel message I was preaching. What's the gospel message? Minimum. The salvific gospel message. Deity, death, resurrection. Read Acts. You set that before them? They think you're nuts or what? As soon as Paul said that was the gospel message I was preaching, he says these words. They added nothing to me. Whoa, who's there? Peter, James, and guess who else is there in Acts 2? In Galatians 2, he wasn't in Galatians 1. John. Oh man, this is too good. The 4 most influential Christians who ever lived. Paul, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John. They're all there, and they all agreed. How do you know they agreed? Because in verse 9, they lay, I guess they laid hands on. It says they gave the right hand of fellowship to Paul and Barnabas and said, you take this message to the Gentiles and we'll take it to the Jews. They blessed them and sent them out. They're all preaching the deity, death, resurrection. So, this is a good objection. But critics will say, all right, so you got the homologia and you got the creeds. How do we know it's not telephone tag? How do you know the story didn't just keep getting bigger and bigger and there was really no appearances? Because number one, Paul knew what they were saying as he left, and he was pretty ticked. He meets the risen Jesus himself, and he hears from the other eyewitnesses that they saw Jesus the same way. He got their testimony. And Bart Ehrman says, the atheist, Bart Ehrman says, where do we get closer to eyewitnesses than here? Whoa. And eyewitnesses on what subject? The gospel. And how soon after? 5 to 6 years after the cross. Listen, 1 Thessalonians is good at 20. Mark's great at 30 max. And Matthew and Luke, I won't go through the whole thing, John at 65. Those are still good. They beat Buddha, they beat Alexander to death on the sources. But we got these 6. I'm going to do it one more time. George is going to kick me off here in about 2 minutes. Okay. I don't care, George. I'm still going. No. I'm going to do what Dave Beck got to go over. Just kidding. Okay. Here's the 6 again. He appears several times, including to the 12, mostly groups. Okay. James, the homologia, the beginning of the gospel preaching. It manifests itself in the creeds. We'll talk about that. Paul knows that he meets the risen Jesus, and then he goes for the horse's mouth, so to speak, and he gets it from Peter and James, and later he gets it from John too. The eyewitnesses said the creeds and homologia were accurate because they were eyewitnesses. And unlike the soldier who wrote his memoirs of World War II in 1990, I mean, great, that's fantastic. That's super. But this is 5 to 6 years after the cross, and we have it all. There's nothing like this in ancient religion. There's nothing like this. You're going to look a long way before you find anything like this in ancient history, period. Ancient history. Yeah, but this is a supernatural event. We know supernatural. Time out. We know supernatural things don't happen. Is that what you were going to say? Yes. Let me tell you guys something. Dr. Beck lectured on naturalism today. Naturalists don't tell you this. No argument proves naturalism. They have no data to prove that this world is all there is. It's a very well-kept secret. They don't want to debate this topic because they don't have any data. As Bill Dembski, you know the guy, PhD math, PhD philosophy, Discovery Institute, as Bill Dembski says, naturalists have no empirical data for their view. None. No science. And yet, what's their best teaching? Science says, oh, well then, okay, thank you. Where's your scientific data? I don't want to talk about that. I guess you don't. But you're going to judge over us and say this world is all there is, and you've got nothing by way of evidence. You've got no data. You've got no data. And we've got all this? Yeah, but it's a supernatural. Ho, 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 ho. Who says the supernatural is not true? We do, and and you have no evidence. None. None. So quit running your mouth. Seriously. By the way, I stop at this point and talk about near-death experiences. Different topic. A lot of you know I do that. There are over 48 highly evidenced NDE cases where the person has no heart or brain activity, and they report things sometimes up to 1,200 miles away that are confirmed, and they have no brain or heart activity. If all that shows you that there's another world and there's an afterlife, then don't talk to me about talking about the resurrection, which is the afterlife. NDEs and resurrection are blood brothers as far as talking about the afterlife. And they have incredibly strong empirical data for afterlife. By the way, in a recent survey, 32% of atheists and agnostics in a survey, 32% believe in heaven. Whoa, from your view, Naturalism and agnosticism, yeah, 32% say they believe in heaven. Ah, you guys are mixed up. This is bad. Folks, I'm going to stop right there. But this, I wish I could tell you how practical this is. I'll tell you some, maybe I'll add it on the beginning of creeds. I'll tell you why this makes a different in practical terms. But for right now, it validates all our preaching, all our church building. That's what it did in the book of Acts. That's how it worked. If the resurrection of Christ is true, remember this sentence. If the resurrection of Christ is true, Christianity is true. If Jesus was raised from the dead, that means Jesus is the Son of God. God wouldn't raise a heretic from the dead. If he was raised, that means he died. That's the gospel. If the resurrection of Jesus is true, Christianity follows. That's how strong our case is.
So I'm almost 60 now, so it's okay to have tears rolling down my face because I was 19 years old. It's 40 years ago. When these guys were young jocks in their 30s with PhDs. Can you imagine sitting every single Wednesday night for 2.5 hours with these guys for 15 weeks? And my faith was reignited. 40 years later, it's still burning strong. Is your mind being challenged today? Anybody? Is your heart being strangely warmed? Your spirit? It's really powerful stuff. Thank you for being here. We got a short break coming back to the creeds. Thank you, Gary. And to take a break, books are out there, restrooms on both sides. Come on back for the creeds. You're not going to want to miss this last hour. your seats. Gary and Dave will do a short Q&A at the end today. So Gary, you got about 45 to 50 minutes for the creeds, and then we'll do a short Q&A time at 3 o'clock with you and Dave for a few minutes. So you can give it back up for Dr. Gary as he comes up to do the creeds. Find your seats. We're going to get started.
I think I'm all set. Oh, just for the clicker? Oh, great.
The green's for, and if you want a chair at all, you can always sit back.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, George.
You want a water or no?
Yeah, you know what? I wouldn't mind. Thank you. Oh, got one here? Is this yours or is this a new one?
It's brand new.
Had to say that. Thank you, folks. Okay. Boy, just think how fast I would have to have moved in that first lecture if I had to put the creeds in it. But now we can do it separately. Folks, let me maybe start this way. George said I can go till 6 o'clock, so. I get asked frequently, what are the strongest arguments for the resurrection? And even people who read resurrection material are surprised by my answer. I would say, and they're neck and neck. Sometimes I say one, sometimes I say the other. But definitely the two strongest arguments of the resurrection, in my opinion, we just did them in the last lecture, are what the creeds are and how we know they're true. I didn't tell you much about the creeds, but I told you that Paul checked out the resurrection message with the disciples. So what keeps them from being phone tag is the meeting with the other apostles in Galatians 1 and then again in Galatians 2, the big four. And the other one I would say is the creeds. I'd say the creeds and Paul's meeting with them in Jerusalem are the two strongest arguments for the resurrection, in my opinion. Now, if you're going to say, well, you already said the appearance to the 12 is the strongest one, I would make that probably number 3, but I wouldn't bicker with you if you said you think the appearance to group appearance in the New Testament is the strongest. Wouldn't have a thing with that at all. But certainly to me, those are the 3 strongest arguments. The group appearances, the creeds, and the fact that Paul checked both out with the apostles. I love that word hysteresis in Galatians 1:18 because that shows you Paul was in a mode about checking things out. And it was the gospel he was checking out. Folks, Paul's scholarship and how giant a mind he was in those days. Why do you think God appeared to him on the way to Damascus? God knew Paul could change the world single-handedly. He produces this scholar who's honest as day is long, wouldn't lie to you, is going to write 13 books that bear his name. He's got other disciples doing other things. For example, Clement may be the same Clement mentioned in the book of Philippians. He may be the same. And he wrote a letter to the Corinthians with some very important information about Jesus, and it's dated the same time as the Gospel of John, about 95 AD. Clement could be the same Clement authorized by Paul, and his book is also to the Corinthians. By the way, 2 other names now that I mentioned Clement. Clement's 95. Ignatius and Polycarp are usually dated 107 and 110. Those are only 7 to 10 years after the close of the New Testament canon in 100 AD. So you've got sources. When people say, what do you have outside the New Testament? You can say, well, there's 3 early Christian sources who were in positions of authority right there, Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp. And then they'll probably go, oh, well, that's outside the New Testament. Okay, I should have specified. What about non-Christian sources? And the sources that the critics think are the best, well, it's out there on the table if it's not sold out, Historical Jesus, and I have, I think, 16 or 17 sources for the historical Jesus within 150 years after his death. But the 2 that the critics respect the most are Josephus and Tacitus. Tacitus is sometimes called the best Roman historian, writing about 112 to 120 AD, and had access to the Roman records, by the way. And Josephus writing probably earlier than the Gospel of John. So if anybody says, oh, the non-Christian sources, but here's why I'll get right into the creeds after making this comment. Here's why I don't spend a lot of time on non-Christian sources outside the New Testament. There's plenty. And I've got that book on it. Critics don't even think they're that good. Okay, you ready for this? What do critics think is the best arguments? If you're going to make a case for the resurrection, let's just say you're asking somebody who doesn't believe it. But if they were to make a case for it, what would they use? You know what they'll say? Paul. And they'll also throw in a number of facts from the Gospels. There's a number of things they will allow you to use in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John's coming back. Have you seen Blomberg's new book, Calling for the Fourth Quest for the Historical Jesus? John's making some comeback. John hasn't been the most accepted of the four Gospels, but it's making a comeback. So those are my answers. If you wanted me to give three, I would say I'd mention all three of them. The group appearances, especially the 12, the creeds right now, and thirdly, Paul's trip ascertaining these appearances from talking to the eyewitnesses themselves, all by 36 AD. You know, I can say this hundreds of times, and I have, in lectures, and I still never get over being excited by this message. 6 key historical facts within 6 years, and they're going to tell me, go read Buddha? Oh, I'm thinking, you must think 600 is about the same as 6. Or you must think, oh no, I'm going to use a better source. Let's go with the secular one, Alexander. Oh, so you think 425 to 450. I think you said there's one in 280. There is, but it's not the best source. The best sources are Arian and Plutarch at 425 to 450 AD. I suppose you think that's better than 6. Yeah, but you're doing supernatural. Time out. By the way, I did this in a debate with one of the 2 or 3 best-known atheists, not Bart Ehrman, but one of the 2 or 3 best-known atheist guys who don't like Christian apologists. And when he said that in the debate, it was a dialogue back and forth. It's Michael Cohen and I against this guy and another atheist. And he said, well, there's no supernatural world. There's no such thing as a supernatural world. And I said, time out. Let's talk about NDEs. Do you know what he said? It's on tape. You know what he said? He goes, I don't want to discuss NDEs. I said, I'll bet you don't. If I were you, I wouldn't want to discuss NDEs either because it sure ruins your worldview. It really does. They say there's no other world? Then you tell me what happens. Okay, so I'd say those are the 3 best. Trip to Jerusalem for Paul, the early creeds, and group appearances, I'd make third. Okay, let's talk about the creeds. What are these things? All right, and I suppose, I'm not a linguist, but I suppose in every language there are such things as creeds. And we often use them to teach preschoolers the alphabet, whatever language they're using, and we teach them to do the alphabet and their own language. We teach them little ditties. Now in English, here's some secular ones. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. That's a creed. Here's another one. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Okay, 2 secular ones. Here's another one. Some creeds in the New Testament are hymns. They were sung. Well, how about this secular one? A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Remember that one? Because when you put notes to it, you learn it faster. And these little kids who are learning that can't sign their names, but they can learn the alphabet. Maybe they're 3 years old, 4 years old, and you teach them A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Those are secular examples. Here's Christian examples. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Can a 4-year-old sing that and not be able to write his or her name? Yes, they can. That's a creed. That's a creed done to song. And Colossians 1 and Philippians 2 are most likely sung creeds. Okay, what's a creed? First of all, I got to probably quit calling them creeds because people get them mixed up and they think I'm talking about Nicaea, Chalcedon, the late ones from 325, 375, 450. By the way, the Nicene Creed is not from Nicaea. That's just something that's often said. I think traditions, I've been calling them creeds for too long. I'm, teaching old people new tricks. You know how that goes. Probably traditions is the better word. But they mean the same thing. I now in my publishing, I call them creedal traditions. So this could be traditions. They're the answer to the question, what did the earliest church do? Remember my line here? What did the earliest church do before 1 Thessalonians was written? If that is indeed the first New Testament book in 50 AD, how did they get around up until that point? I know it's close, that's only 20 years from the cross, but was there a big lag there on getting data? No, the answer to it is having the 6 facts. The disciples running around talking about it, eyewitnesses. James running around talking about it, eyewitness. The homologia, the earliest preaching, Acts 1 through 5, 10, 13. Other passages sometimes put in there, Acts 17, Pauline, sometimes put in there. So we have a track record on these things, and that's how they filled in the space from 30 to 50. Now the 6 gets you up to about 36 AD, max. Could be 35. Okay. And these are in the New Testament books. I said there's dozens of them, and they're often referred to as pre-Pauline. Now, let me make a distinction. There's 2 kinds of pre-Pauline. Sometimes pre-Pauline means it predates 1 Thessalonians. Sometimes pre-Pauline means these creeds are between the cross. They can't be before the cross because there's no report of resurrection. So they have to be between 30 and 50 AD. But there's a second meaning of pre-Pauline. This is even the more evidential ones. Those are the ones that Paul apparently knew when he was left for Damascus. He left for Damascus. Which creeds did he know? Bart Ehrman says he knew a lot of them, a whole lot of them, that he writes before he was converted. That's really in the big resurrection book, I already gave the copy to Randy. I owed it to him because I told you he reviewed 2 chapters. I differentiate. I call them pre-Pauline 1 and pre-Pauline 2. Pre-Pauline 1 is up to Paul, up to, let's say, 30 to 36. And pre-Pauline 2 is 36 to 40. Sorry, 36 to 50, 1 Thessalonians. Now let me make a confession. Somebody says, how do you date those creeds? You can't date them specifically. We know they're after 30, and we know they're before 50. We know that because they can't be before the cross because of the data. And they can't be after that because Paul starts writing about them very, very early and including them in his works. But I go here by the words of the critical scholars. Bart Ehrman says we have creeds from 1 to 2 years after the cross. 1 to 2 years. And by the way, when they're in Acts, I call them creeds, but when they're in Acts, they're called the sermon summaries. They're still creeds, but there's the ones in Acts 1 through 5, 10 and 13 are called sermon summaries. But I didn't have time to explain it there, so I called them creeds. They're creedal traditions. And the critics love the creedal passages in Acts 1 through 5, 10, and 13. By the way, I don't know if this is time for a bibliographic stop. If I don't stop now, I may not get it in today. Let me give you 3 classics on the creeds. And they're not really new books. They've been out for a long time, but they were, I wouldn't say they're ignored, just not a whole lot of people didn't know about them. On the Acts sermon summaries, one of the very best sources is by C.H. Dodd, not a conservative. He's probably a moderate plus, a little bit more than an average moderate, but he was a New Testament professor at Cambridge. And the book is The Apostolic Preaching and Its Developments. The Apostolic Preaching and Its Developments. If I remember correctly, it was published in German. It was published in French and German before the English version came out. He was a German scholar. Oscar Coleman, Cullmann. Now, Ben Shaw and I, he's my research assistant I've already told you about. Ben and I put out a new edition of that book with Whiff and Stock. You go, well, but it's his book with just your new forward. It is, but let me tell you why we did it. It's been out of print for decades, and I wanted to use it for a PhD text, and you couldn't get it anywhere. And if you could find it online, you'd often pay over $100 for it. It's only like 65 pages long. So they needed to do this thing, and they brought it out. So you can get it from Whiff and Stock for like $12. Smaller than my Bible here, smaller than this. And Oscar Coleman, it's called Earliest Christian Confessions. Confessions is another synonym for creeds. That's two. C.H. Dodd, Apostolic Preaching and Its Developments. That was actually written in 1936. Coleman was in English 48 or 49, but the best one, I believe it was a doctoral dissertation written under maybe the best Greek scholar who ever lived. What do you think, Randy? Best Greek scholar who ever lived? Pardon? I didn't mean to put you on the spot like that. You could probably pick a lot if you... A.T. Robertson have to be close. Give you a hint. Princeton. Pardon? Machen. It's got to be, he was at Princeton and he's one. Oh, they're both good. I'm not trying to put him on the spot. If he's right that these names, it's going to be a debate about who's better. But whose name's on all the Greek critical texts from Princeton? Bruce Metzger. I got to hear him when I was in grad school at the University of Detroit. Oh, yeah, that could be. It's just that Metzger did so much. Anyway, Bruce Metzger, this guy did his doctor's degree. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but I mean, he's got three good, those three are really good ones. A.T. Robertson, he's got the great big grammar, New Testament grammar. Machen is really good at Princeton, and Metzger. This guy did his PhD dissertation under Metzger at Princeton, and it's the same title as the Coleman book, Earliest Christian Confessions, but it's a kind of I get the idea it's a rewritten new PhD dissertation from Princeton. It's very conservative, but it's very systematic. It reads like a PhD dissertation, but this guy has done his homework, and it's an extended outline. And he's the best guy, Neufeld. His name is Vernon Neufeld, Neufeld. Vernon, Neufeld. And the book was included in a series that Bruce Metzger edited. But he's the one that talks more than... Dodd does more than just about anybody in the Acts sermon summaries. Neufeld does about more than anybody on the homologia, the basis for the creeds. That's his doctoral dissertation. He's brilliant on it. And you know what he says is the basis of the homologia? Deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. He says it over and over. Deity, death, resurrection was the basis for the homologia, which became the homologia. It became the center of the creeds. In fact, you want an estimate? About 80% of the New Testament creeds, a couple dozen of them, it's hard to pinpoint them, but by far the majority, maybe 75 or 80%, are on the subject of the gospel. The deity, death, and resurrection is the main subject of these creedal traditions, also called confessions. So Vernon Neufeld, Earliest Christian Confessions. It was published by Erdman's if you get the old book. The new one, it's published by Brill, the research press. the European Research Press. Earliest Christian Confession. Same title as Coleman. Okay, great sources. And if you want to get into that stuff, you can't beat those 3 books, in my opinion. In fact, let me tell you a real quick story. I was lecturing at Tyndale House, Cambridge, years ago, and they asked me to come in and give a lecture. It was in a room about this size, and it was shaped like this. And they asked me to give a lecture on the miracles question, from miracles to the resurrection, from Schleiermacher to the present. Okay, that's another way of saying we're critical scholars from 1800 to date. So I gave this lecture, and I ended up with something very much like this. But I had only been lecturing for about 15 minutes, and Richard Bauckham walked in and sat down. He may be the best-known New Testament scholar, he or maybe Tom Wright. Would you agree with those two? They're probably the best-known New Testament scholars today. Unfortunately, Larry Hurtado and Jimmy Dunn. Jimmy Dunn wasn't quite so conservative as the others, but they both passed away in the last few years. Hurtado and Dunn. If you see books by them, but right now, Bauckham is still writing, and of course, Tom Wright is. So Richard Bauckham came in and sat down, and I went right ahead and kept giving my lecture, and I took Richard Bauckham's name in vain because he was part of this lecture that day. And it was done. The people in the group were either PhD students at Cambridge or they were professors. And some of them went back to Richard to talk, and some of them came up to me, and when it was over, I walked back, and I said, well, you've heard me take your name in vain. You've heard me track your name out today. I'd be glad to hear any criticism or any issues. He goes, no, I think you did a good job. I've got nothing to say. And I said, Richard, we just had lunch together a few months before that, and we knew each other. And I said, Richard, I know you can come up with something if you wanted to be critical. He goes, okay, one comment. And he said, you didn't mention Oscar Coleman's book, The Earliest Christian Creeds. And I laughed, and I said, I'm not laughing at you, Richard. I gave the same lecture at Oxford University a few days ago, and I spent 10 minutes of it talking about that book. I just didn't talk about it today. Sorry. But that's the book he meant. It's like 64 pages long. And that's the one he still wanted to talk about. And the book's from the late 40s. That's how influential these are, that he would even say that as the best text out there. Okay, so away from my bibliography and back to this. I said 2 senses of pre-Pauline. You go, well, how do you date them? You can't date the creeds except to say 30 to 50. Except that critics, if you know where to look, Bart Ehrman says several of them are 1 to 2 years. Gerrit Ludemann, the atheist New Testament scholar, said they started preaching it immediately. The Jesus Seminar said that the 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following was already in existence when Paul took off for Damascus. So I go by their dates. I use their dates. Okay. Here's some types. I just mentioned hymns. Sermon summaries are from the book of Acts. This is about the 5th time I've said this, but I'll say it again. Acts 1 through 5, 10, and 13 are the best known ones. 1 through 5 and 10 are Petrine. Peter is the speaker. 13 is Pauline. There's other ones that other people put in, but those are the most solid ones, sermon summaries. And they're all brief statements. And you're probably going to ask, how do we know these things? Well, first of all, let's look at Oscar Coleman's book. Here is how the creeds were used in the early church. They were used in baptism, in worship. Get this one, exorcism. Persecution, that's the one where Paul says, critics don't like 1 Timothy for Paul, but that's where Paul said Jesus was faithful and gave the good testimony before Pilate, and we should give the good testimony when we're in those times too. Persecution. An anti-heresy polemic. What's the source he uses? 1 Corinthians 15:3. And he goes all the way to 8. Paul adds his own testimony in verse 8. 8 is not part of the creed. Verse 8. But that's where Paul gives his eyewitness testimony. That's Coleman. How do you identify creeds? Well, first of all, you got to, I already asked Randy a question, didn't mean to, but ask a guy like Randy. Seriously, if you want to know how to identify the creeds, get a degree in Greek. You got to know the Greek really, really well. The folks who know Greek for a living, they're major, they got PhDs, they've been a professor for 30 years and their field is Greek. They're the guys that tell you where these are. But they must have a pretty good idea where they are because they agree where the major ones are. They agree where they are. The text is introduced by words like deliver, confess, or believe. For example, Romans 10:9. If we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in our heart that God's raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Even Rudolf Bultmann, who I think was to the left of Bart Ehrman, Bultmann calls this a baptismal creed. People, unlike a lot of our baptismal services today, we pastors, I pastored for a few years, Kalamazoo actually, Detroit too, but you get the person in the water, you say, Tom, Jennifer, have you received Christ your personal Savior? And all they do is say, yep, and you go, pastor does all the talking, upon the confession of your faith I baptize you, and you do it. In the early church, they apparently gave testimonies in the water. That person spoke. Now, I understand the Baptist answer is usually, well, they already gave their testimony before the deacons, the elders, something like that. But they seem to do it because Romans 10:9 seems to be a baptismal proclamation in the water there. And it's one way to tell. Repetition. The second one is very, very important, dislocation. The creeds frequently do not fit the context. If you did what they do with creeds, if you did it in a graduate paper, you'd probably get this comment in the margin from your professor: poor transition. The creeds often do not fit the mood and the text of the writing, so it's a dislocation. It's like, whoa, what brought that? If you know Greek really, really well, what brought that little juncture up? They're quoting somebody. That's one way to tell. It's often rhythmical. It's thought that 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, in the Greek, it sort of does this stuff. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, 2 stanzas. But it's rhythmic. Not rhythmic so much like English poetry, not that rhythmical, but it has a cadence to it, oftentimes. Oftentimes, each of the lines are of equal or similar length. Use of language not employed, but there's several words in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 that Paul never uses anywhere else. Nothing improves. There are a lot of authors, New Testament authors, that only use a phrase one time. But that just adds to this, how many of these are known. So, in a way, if you're not a Greek scholar, and I've already told you I'm Greek dangerous, you have to pretty much rely on where the critics say they are. But one thing that's helpful is they almost all agree where these things are. So you can go by that. Okay, this list is written by a guy named Pinchas Lapide. P-I-N-C-H-A-S is the P. P-H-I-N-C-H-A-S. I misspelled it. P-I-N-C-H-S. Lapide. He's a Jewish, non-Christian scholar who has a PhD in New Testament. I heard him say he's one of only 4 in the world. Non-Christian Jewish scholars who have PhDs in New Testament. And he took it at a German university, and he lists all these reasons for believing 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following is a creed. And I'll just let you look down that list because they're some of the same reasons I just gave. But notice he says, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 is so tight and so good, he says it should be considered the work of eyewitnesses. That's Lapide, and he's not a Christian. Now, he's deceased, and but I'm just saying at the time he wrote this, he wasn't a Christian. But, and you might say, well, if he admits all this, why doesn't he become a Christian? Do you know what? He believed that Jesus was raised from the dead and really appeared. Go, okay, I just repeat my question. Why did he become a Christian? Because he held a view that's real common among university-trained Jewish scholars. He holds the view, it's really, if you haven't heard this, it's really interesting. He believes that Jews come to God through the law because that's what the first 5 books of the Old Testament in particular, what they teach. So they're special, that they're God's choice people, and they come through the law. Okay, you ready? Everybody else comes through Jesus Christ. It's incredible. Now, he didn't include himself, but he thinks other people, you know why? Jesus is the Gentile Messiah for these guys. Jesus is the Gentile Messiah. I mean, I sure hope he came to the Lord, but all I'm telling you is that's a provocative argument because he allowed the data and he sees the force of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 is by far the best known of the creeds. Romans 10:9 might be next. Another really good one is Romans 1, 3, and 4. Another good one is Romans 4:25. Another good one is Philippians 2, the Christological hymn. Critics don't think Paul wrote Colossians, but those who do, or whether you do or don't, they still think Colossians 1 is a early creedal hymn. And Randy, you do a lot on deity. I've asked, Hurtado when he was alive, Bauckham, I think Dunn too. I think I asked all 3 of them. Are there any verses in the New Testament that teach that Jesus was ontologically God? That's a loaded word of philosophy. But it means, are there any verses that teach that Jesus, as to his very being, was God? And they all 3 answered, no, Jews didn't do ontology, only the Greeks did. It's not frankly, for these guys, they're great scholars, but that's not true. It's just not true. This is a philosophical question on New Testament. They shouldn't have answered it that way. You go, well, then what would you say? What if I told you that there's 3 times in the New Testament at least where Jesus is called ontologically deity or God? 3 times. 2 of them are creeds. 2 of them are creeds. Philippians chapter 2. You go, yeah, but that's where it says he didn't want to selfishly grasp after the title of God. Yeah, I understand that. But that's not the phrase I'm talking about. I'm talking about another Greek word. Jesus, the Greek word is morphe, and morphe in English means form. To me, here's how I think of morphe. I think of morphe is someone says, oh, look at Bob's got his roughed-in house going up over there, and all it is a 2x4 outline of the house. That's a form in English. But the primary definition of morphe in Greek is essence, nature. And Philippians 2 says he was in his morphe, God, and next verse, in his humanity, a servant. That's why Philippians 2 is right in the middle of the conversation of how Jesus could be the God-man. But it is an ontological deity verse. In his morphe, he was God. Here's the other one. Very obscure verse, but a creed. Hebrews 1:3. Hebrews 1:3. The Greek there means the exact representation of God's nature. So seriously, I mean, I highly respected Hurtado and Jimmy Dunn when they were alive, and Bauckham now, who's still alive. Highly respected them. But guess what? One of them's come around. Bauckham's theory is that the best way to get the deity of Christ is take the Old Testament references for Jehovah, which were applied to Jesus in the New Testament. Romans 10:9 is one of them. Because how do you know that Lord can mean other things? Lord can mean sir. In the Middle Ages, Lord was the guy who ran the manor. How do you know it means Lord? Because after Romans 10:9, and then he says, with the heart we believe, that's the I do part, that's Romans 10:10. But 3 verses later, Paul quotes Joel in the Old Testament, where Joel says, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved, and Lord there is Jehovah. That's morphe. Jesus is called, and that's why Heiser, I just got that in the plane coming over here, I saw his reference. He calls Daniel 7, which Jesus referred to twice, referred to himself. He says Daniel 7 is used by Jesus, is Yahweh become man. That's Heiser. He passed away, but he was so well respected by scholars before he died. So that's 2 verses for the high view of the deity of Christ. Philippians 2, Hebrews 1. The 3rd verse, by the way, is not a creed, but it's Colossians 2:9. In him dwells the fullness of the Godhead bodily. Not a creed, but it's the only time that word is used in the New Testament, and it's a very stilted word, very strong word for deity. Romans 10:9. And Paul says he was that while he was in a human body. In him dwells the fullness of the Godhead bodily. Now, he's probably talking present tense in heaven, but the Orthodox view is Jesus still has his body. Okay. So that's Christology there. Okay, I just made this comment earlier. The majority of the creedal traditions are on the gospel data. Deity, death, resurrection. Here's conclusions. Now, I can't read these things. I needed to make my print a lot bigger. I'll tell you what, I'll just let you guys read them. Can you see? Oh, hey, listen, this is better. Ha! Here's the conclusion. All these guys are huge critical scholars. These are all big names. Oscar Coleman, the creeds may be apostolic. We don't know for sure, but they at least go back to apostolic times. Dodd, based on what the original apostles had actually taught. Whoa, we're back to eyewitnesses again. Bauckham, tradition received from the Jerusalem apostles. This is in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Howard Clark Key, a member of the Jesus Seminar. He just passed away not terribly long ago, but I met him a few years ago, and he called himself many years ago now, but he called himself an agnostic. He said the early traditions can be critically examined just like in a law court. This is so strange. Critics will not say that New Testament truth can be used in a law court. Key was a member of the Jesus Seminar, and he says these creeds can be taken into a court of law. And he opens his book on what we know about Jesus, Cambridge University Press. He opens his book with 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. Jesus Seminar guy. Larry Hurtado, formulated as early as days or months after the crucifixion. Days or months. Jimmy Dunn, formulated as early as months after the crucifixion. He says 1 Corinthians 15:8 could have dated. He says 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, I might have said 8, 3-7, he says it could have been the same year as the crucifixion. Well, he doesn't literally say the same year, but he says within months. And if you remember that the resurrection happened in the spring, if you add months, you're still in the same year. So they at least could have been in the same year. Most scholars, majority of the creeds, establish the central gospel teaching of the deity, death, resurrection that we're called upon to say yea or nay, I do or not. Now, George, I got 6 minutes. No, what'd you say I could go to? A few minutes. You said a little bit out?
Around 3, and then we'll do a Q&A.
Okay, well then I got a few minutes here. Any question? Right? You said till 3?
We'll do Q&A at the end with you and Dave both.
But right now I got till 3? Ha ha. When have you, if you guys knew me, when have you ever seen me stop early? Okay, any comments, questions, derogatory remarks? Yes.
Paul, singing in prison, is this a tangent to singing creed?
I'm going to need this, I'm sorry.
Just one more time.
Paul sings in prison, when he's in prison, in chains against the wall, and he is certain of his mortality coming the next day, but he's singing, and I understand this is out of Psalms, singing creeds that they would have known, Psalms 113 up to 118, including the alphabetic 19 or 136.
Boy, oh boy.
Have you looked at this?
I'm sorry, I'm still missing your question. I didn't tell you guys I'm deaf.
As a creed,
And I'm really old.
when you were speaking of creeds being sung,
Yep. Yeah.
that Paul would have, one of the creeds might been Psalms 113 and
Yeah,
on.
I don't know about that, but I'm saying in principle, yes,
okay.
it could be. By the way, two of the ones I go back to, Psalm 110. Remember when Jesus, before the high priest, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? He says, ego on me, I am. And henceforth you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. By the way, only God was a cloud rider. Only God rode the clouds. And Jesus says he will ride the clouds. And then he says, and I'll be seated on the right hand of God. Now, one thing that's really, really cool about this, there was a book that's first century. I still got 4 minutes. I saw him turn around and look at the clock. Man, you gotta watch these pastors. The early creeds. There's a book that's first century. Now they're maybe saying first century BC, the book of Enoch. And there's a passage in the book of Enoch called the similitudes of Enoch. The Son of Man is used there, and that's a phrase Jesus' most popular name for himself and before the high priest. And the Son of Man in the book of Enoch is worshipped, is seated on God's right hand. There's 7 or 8 biggies, but to me the big 4, seated on God's right hand, worshipped. He forgives sin. Remember when he did it in Mark 2, said it was blasphemy. And I'm leaving one out. He'll be worshipped, right hand of God, forgave sin. Do you remember one more?
I think he comes on the clouds.
Coming on the clouds is in that phrase before the high priest. Thank you. Coming on the clouds. You redeemed yourself from the earlier one. So folks, that thing in Mark 14, 61 to 64, Jesus' own words, and I think it's the clearest verse for the deity of Christ in the Gospels. That's just my view. I would use it over John 8 or John 10 any day.
What is your opinion about the Didache?
What did I mean by?
The Didache, the
Didache?
teachings. Yeah.
Did I say that?
No, he's wondering what your opinion is about the teaching.
Didache is an early writing. It's called The Teaching of the 12 is a subtitle. It's in an early place right now. They used to date it around 130-ish, but now it's coming back, and people are thinking it could be first century. But I don't think you can trace Didache to the apostles. Do you have any view on that? Now, it's supposed to be based on the apostles' teachings, and I think that's a tough one. I don't think there's much in the Didache you can get your hands on, A, and prove it's apostolic, B, and use for anything in apologetics. So I think it's there, and if they come up with something, I'm open, but I'm not aware of anything using it now.
One question. In 2 Thessalonians 2:15, this one's often cited by Orthodox and Catholics, so then, brothers and sisters, stand firm and hold to the traditions you were taught, whether by what we said or what we wrote. I'm curious about any scholarship or recommendations you might have, people who've written about not only these creeds, but I'm wondering about studies done on what the practices of the early Christians were in their.
What's the last thing? The what of the early Christians?
The practices of the early Christians, their traditions.
Yeah, well, they're in the creeds too. But with that phrase you just read, I think that's a creedal introduction. A lot of the comments, in the pastoral epistles, which critics don't accept but evangelicals do, is Paul, like the pastoral epistles, they'll say things like this. Still got 1 minute. They'll say things like this: observe the traditions of the elders, or here's a trustworthy saying, or I tell you what. Those are all introductions, and usually what happens now in our translations, the newest translations that come out, they translate them as almost like poetry. Remember I told you that they translate them like that. Philippians 2, Colossians 1, the pastorals, they're put like that now. So they're starting to, in our translations for lay people, they're starting to make the creeds this way. So it's starting to make its way into the church, and it is a top argument for what we believe. So, am I done?
Stay right here, though. Stay right here. So you have been at a really good ball game, and as a kid, I love this, with the Tigers. Actually, for me, it was Fenway Park with the Red Sox.
Tigers
And
did
the
something
ninth
good.
inning, you end with a tie, and you get an extra inning. Can you guys give 15 more minutes? If you need to leave, we understand it. But you can clap really loud if you can give maybe 15 more minutes for just some Q&A.
For what?
Anybody?
For this?
Come on up, Dave. We're going to have Dave come up, and you come up on the platform. We're just doing a last 15-minute Q&A.
Okay.
Come on up.
All right.
I know, Randy, he said you were in the top 5 of his students. That is no doubt academically, but I'm one of his favorite students, just so you know.
What did you say?
I said Randy might have been in the top 5 academically, but I'm one of the favorites, so there you go.
Ah.
There you go. Come on up,
You
Dave.
know what? There's 4 others. How do you know you're not one of the ones?
I know I'm not one of the other 4.
Okay, where?
You know, you graduate to magna cum laude, summa cum laude, or thank the good laude. So you know which one I was. Come on up, Dave. We're gonna have
Dave, you probably need this. No offense. You probably need to sit. No.
Dave fell on the ice, so to give the guy a break as he climbs up here.
guy's fallen
It
a
wasn't
couple
in
times.
Detroit, though.
He won't
That was
take the
down in
time to
Virginia.
tell you what silly
Have
thing
a
he
chair.
did to hurt his back, but
And Joe, you have the other mic.
jumped off a ladder and still hasn't recovered from it. Oh, you have that? Okay.
You mentioned Michael Heiser. Can you speak a little bit? Yes.
Heiser?
Yes. Can you speak a little bit more about him? I know a little bit about him, just recently been introduced to him, and maybe what you know about his teaching
what I
on the
understand-
counsel of God and those kinds of things.
From what I understand, he went to evangelical schools and was learning the evangelical way of interpretation. And he did an MA in history with an emphasis on Jewish history. And he was still at that time, he tells a story, he was still at that time thinking like evangelicals translate the Old Testament. Then he went to University of Wisconsin because they have a very influential PhD program in Hebrew Jewish thought, did his PhD in Jewish thought, and he hasn't changed his views like being a liberal, but he's changed his views like that he thinks as evangelicals we do not translate the Old Testament like the Jews translated the Old Testament, and maybe nothing liberal. I'm just saying he has a different twist. And one of his main ideas is he thinks that there were a bunch of divine gods, small d, small g, in the ancient world. Satan would have been one, the fallen angels. The angels were divine, small d, not worshipped. And then the fallen angels are the bad ones, and they came to earth. But Paul called Satan the god of this world. And Heiser thinks he's got a whole new twist on what happened with the wiping out the Canaanites. His view is they weren't really killing the people who lived locally, which makes everybody so mad. They were going after the Amalekites and a couple of the giant organizations. He takes the interpretation of Genesis 6 that these gods and goddesses, these mighty beings, procreated with human women, and their offspring were giants. A lot of them were, and Goliath was one of them. And that there are a lot of these large groups, and what Joshua was commanded to kill was not the little guys and their wives and children and their stock. It was to wipe out this giant race, which is the netherworld of Satan and his hordes. And that's the ones that Joshua went after. Remember that when they first saw him, they said, we look like ants or grasshoppers, we look like... Yeah, Heiser says, yeah, because these guys were really big. They were like a lot of Goliaths. And then these guys went after them. And God wanted them to, if I understand Heiser, God wanted them to rid Canaan of the giants that came from demons, fallen angels, and women, which is Genesis 6. But he's got a little section there in Daniel 7 how Jesus takes it to himself, and that's where he calls Jesus Yahweh in a human body.
On giants, and I'm sure you looked at that translation, whether it was terrestrial or
Translation of what?
giants, the word.
In what text?
We have a Greek scholar here. When it speaks of the giants, the Nephilim, as you're, and I agree. I don't think it would fall on the absolute. But when you're speaking of the translation of the word, it was there in Joshua. You hear it in kind of both sides of that. It falls on both sides. Nephilim is one time stated, and the other is
Amalekites
is giants. So he may be speaking of two different distinctions. And
You might, but he asked me if I would tell what Heiser's view is. I can just tell you what Heiser believes. I'm no authority in this area at all. I just was reading them for like the first time yesterday on the plane, so it's really a challenge. Reading Heiser, unfortunately, like I said, the guy died at 61 years old of cancer, and everything he wrote was a bestseller. It's all published by Lexham. It's total mainline evangelical.
this gets to the question without making a statement. Does this suppose that the fallenness of angels is still occurring?
Yeah, I think he raises that, but I don't think I read what he says about it. Could that still be going on? Anyway, the idea is Joshua was commanded to rule out the offspring of fallen angels, not wipe out all the people. It's a really provocative interpretation of what happened in Israel.
I have a question on creation and the question of carbon dating and dinosaurs. Carbon dating and dinosaurs. So the question is, if carbon dating dates dinosaurs to millions of years ago, where does that put the creation timeline for mankind?
Did you hear the question? Both of us are like 75% deaf, so you should see us in the airport and on the plane. What? That's how we are. I didn't get the question, did you? You go ahead, and if you heard it, you talk to it.
Is this on? Yeah. I take it you were asking about the reliability of carbon dating?
I am. Yeah, the reliability of carbon dating and the timeline for the creation story and
I don't know. Carbon dating seems to be very reliable within
2,000 years.
a couple thousand years. That seems to be very reliable, maybe a little longer, but once we get to hundreds of thousands of years, nobody, it's pretty hard.
It's hard to prove it.
And especially, when we're talking about millions of years, I don't know how to establish that. There's so much, this relies on that, but then that relies on
And
this.
neither one of us know what we're talking about. But we both heard that it's good for 2,000. That's not our area, but we heard that repeated a lot.
Yeah.
By people who are good.
Because we can check that out. We have things that we know date from 2000.
So
and then we can carbon date something and verify it. So we know we're pretty reliable with carbon dating within
2,000
that
years.
sort of time span.
A couple thousand years. Okay, so would it be safe to assume that dinosaurs were on the ark?
Oh my goodness. First of all, seriously, doesn't that assume we have something of it? I don't think there's a lot of people right now that say, maybe somebody else can speak to this. I've done a fair amount of reading on the ark. I'm not sure very many people think we have a piece of it to carbon date.
Yeah.
A lot of people say, well, I found something, then it turns out later to be something else. And if anybody else has something more authoritative, I'm not up in this stuff, but the things I've read, I'm not sure there's anything authoritative that says we have part of it.
I mean, it is rather interesting that there's hardly a civilization known anywhere around the world that doesn't have some legend, myth, saga, call it whatever you want, some story, narrative of a flood.
The Babylonians.
And I mean, everywhere. Every continent we know of.
Even
There are these accounts, and they always involve a flood of some sort. It may be somewhat localized, but it's always a flood. There's always a boat of some sort. There's always some guy with his family who is rescued on the boat, and there are always animals along with it. Now, you know, that's not everything, but I mean, that is strange, isn't it? That everybody has these stories, including all sorts of people groups that are clearly unrelated, that haven't had contact, but they all have these stories, and they all seem to date somewhere around 15,000, somewhere in that vicinity. That seems
I'd rather talk about creeds.
But yeah,
I'm just saying, that's not a put down to your question. We don't read this area. We hear things that other people say, but we're not.
well, I read some things.
Yeah. Then you answer it.
Is there one last question? I see a hand over here. Sorry, but right here in the check shirt. And it's your sister that wants you home by 4 o'clock. It's not me. See, there you go. It's your sister.
My sister.
I mean, we are, as Christians, instructed to spread the gospel, and and you mentioned, Dr. Beck, that through creation, everyone would know God and His existence. So, how do you present the argument towards those who say that spreading the gospel or to those who are in unknown regions or areas, those people who can't be reached, and how would they be saved?
How many hours do we have?
Yeah.
That's not your area.
Well,
It's not a creed question.
I didn't hear the question, so.
Oh, yeah. Did you hear the question? Did you hear the question? Those who haven't heard, how can they be saved?
Hey, I only contribute one thing, just a rule that I have. Doesn't answer your question directly, but I think it's really, really helpful. I know this sounds very trite, but I've given up a long time ago trying to play God. And I tell people, God did not call me to separate the wheat from the tares. So when God says somebody's in heaven, they're in heaven. When somebody says they're not, they're not. And we all say, as Baptists and others, we'll say, we're going to be really surprised who's going to be there, and we're going to be really surprised who's not there. I'll just leave it with, it's God's business. I'm glad He's making the choice, and I don't have much to say about this because nothing I say is, God's the ultimate authority, and whoever He lets in or lets not, I'm just dumb enough to do what He says is true.
I think I've come to the view, I have some good Calvinist friends who think that there are going to be, including a brother, yes, my brother, who think that there are going to be far less people in heaven than we thought. The older I get, the more I think there are going to be a whole lot more people in heaven than what we thought.
And I'm with him with that last comment. I'm thinking, whatever God says is boss, but I'm thinking there's some verses in the New Testament that are pretty interesting.
If God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, really just a couple of us? Come on.
You can clap for that. There we go. That's awesome
Good.
stuff.
That was good.
We're going to wrap it up, and they're going to be out at the book table. If you want to get a book, there's a few left out there. Just remember Dave's book, that is a demo. You put your name and address down, you can get that. Forever Loved is a great love story. I encourage that, the story of Jesus. What a great, great day. One more round of applause for these guys. I'm going to close this in prayer. And I am just enough preacher to say that if you haven't yet believed deity, death, and resurrection, would you receive Jesus today? And if you need prayer today, we're going to linger up here. You may have philosophical questions, theological questions. If you need to receive the Messiah, Christ, in your life, we don't want you to leave here today. Let's spend the rest of our lives being witnesses. We're not original eyewitnesses, but we are witnesses too. That's what we're called to be. Let's have a word of prayer. God, we just worship you today. We thank you and praise you for this day with Dave and Gary. Our minds have been challenged. Our hearts have been stirred, so much like those two walking on the Emmaus Road, talking to Jesus as he preached himself out of all of the Old Testament, the law, the prophets, the Psalms. They said, weren't our hearts so strangely warmed? And as we've talked about you, God, this morning and Jesus this afternoon, our hearts have been strangely warmed too. And may we spend the rest of our lives as your witnesses. And as Dave shared, we're going to learn about you for infinity and beyond. Thank you for your love. May every person here today, those that may be watching this live stream in the next weeks and maybe years, may they receive the risen Christ. Believe and receive. We worship you. May we go from this place like rejoicing for having been together. Bless Gary and Dave, their ministries, their travels, open doors for them in this world where they can defend the gospel, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks again for coming. The book table will be open. They'll be here about another 20 minutes, but I told your sister you'll be home at